Welcome to the fourth and final segment for this week. I'm just going to share my screen with you one more time. Okay. So we're going to talk about, I'm sorry, it's actually the penultimate. There's one more segment after this. In this segment, we're going to talk about humans in nature in indigenous thought. So there are many more groups around the world than just people who live in the Western way. So we're going to encounter some of those groups today. So before we think about them, it's really useful to think about the evolution of humans and just human history on a larger scale. Now, our predecessors, Homo erectus, the first record that we have of Homo erectus goes back to 1.8 million years. This is still a very, very close member of our family, but who we are now, Homo sapiens, branched off from Homo erectus around 300,000 years ago. So we have been anatomically the way that we are and the species that we are for 300,000 years. We have evidence of early cultivation, so people growing food going back to 12,000 years ago. So you often hear people say that agriculture dates to around 10 to 12,000 years. People debate exactly how long, but that's the figure typically given. Now, small family farms with intensive production, intensive meaning that a lot is concentrated in one spot and it's diverse, like the farms that you all drew. Those kind of farms started to really appear around 2,500 years ago. But the system that you have all seen, that I showed you all the pictures of, and what really is at the core of producing food, at least in the United States, only dates back to about 70 years ago, right after World War II. In the 1950s is where we really see it take hold. So really, before people started to cultivate, and for many years until family farms actually were established, people were still really doing a lot of gathering, a lot of hunting, and just a little bit of cultivation. Now, E.O. Wilson, who is a very famous biologist, has put it this way, that for more than 99% of human history, people have lived in hunter-gatherer bands, totally and intimately involved with other organisms. So for 99% of our entire existence, we have been hunter-gatherers. And many groups, even today, indigenous groups who may no longer be hunter-gatherers, some are, who may produce food in small farms, but they have a lot in common, or at least they can hold different ideas about nature than those that are really prevalent in Western ways of thinking. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work of Tim Ingold, who's a British anthropologist who you're going to read a little bit in a minute. And what he really shows in his books is this difference between a Western way of thinking and an indigenous worldview in terms of how people perceive their environments. So for example, when we talk about hunting in the US, for example, we'll talk about hunting wild game, this idea that there is a world out there that's wild, that's untamed, that maybe is even dangerous, and that it's out there apart from us, and we go in and we hunt something, take it out of its wild environment and come back. Whereas in indigenous cultures, the environment, the animals, the plants, the forest, the bush, whatever you want to call it, can be seen as a family member. That typically the animal that you're hunting isn't hunted as a wild other, but is actually that animal has agency. That means that that animal is existing with the hunter in mind, and the animal actually sacrifices itself for the hunter. So this idea that rather than going in and forcibly taking something out of a wild existence, that when you're hunting, it's a dynamic relationship with that animal that is aware of you and that sacrifices itself so that you can live and you can eat. And this leads to this idea that in again, in our ways of thinking, we see animals, plants, and forests, for example, as less than human. And because we think humans are superior, we see them as less than us, that they're less intelligent, that maybe they don't have self-awareness, and they certainly don't have maybe a soul or a spirit or any kind of power. And this is totally opposite in many hunter-gatherer tribes and indigenous belief systems, where actually trees, plants, animals, the forest, the bush, the ocean, the lake, all of these aspects of an environment are actually very self-aware, that they possess spirits, they possess souls, and they possess power that is to be both respected and feared. And you will read about this in a minute as well. Another big difference between the Western way of thinking and even a cultivator's way of thinking compared to a hunter-gatherer is this idea that in Western thought, we want to transform the environment. We want to make the environment do what we want it to do. We want to transform it for the purposes of human beings. Whereas in indigenous thought, it's the idea of participating in the environment exactly as it is and preserving it. So you're not trying to transform it, you are just part of it. So your hunting and your gathering relies on you being able to trust that everything will be okay, that the environment will provide for you. So it brings us to this idea of trust versus domination. When you're trying to transform the environment for your own needs, you can slip into seeing it as something that you can dominate, rather than, like I said, something you can trust. The bush will always provide, or the forest will always provide, as long as you're you respect its power, its spirits, its soul, and you work with it and live as part of it. So this kind of can bring us back a little bit to this idea of cultural relativism that we discussed last week, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that the Western view that isn't automatically better or worse, or that the indigenous view is better or worse, or it's right or wrong. There are certain things we can say about them from a scientific perspective, and certain things that we can't. But we can still look at these systems to see which ones are perhaps more sustainable, or which ones don't damage the environment of human beings. And again, it's not automatic that indigenous ways or worldviews don't damage the environment. There are plenty of examples of civilizations, big and small, and even tribal groups that have essentially gone extinct because they overused the environment, or there were social troubles that made the society fall apart. So it's not. We don't want to think of all indigenous groups as automatically more in touch with nature or better in some way. Nor do we want to see the current way of doing things as necessarily always worse. But there are some good and bad outcomes, as we saw that the story with farming isn't necessarily the most happy one. But always try to kind of think from this cultural relativist perspective. We're just trying to understand what is. We can make judgments about how we want to live based on that later, after we've understood the different ways that people go about their lives. So what I would like you to do now is go to activity 4C, which is entitled, How Do Different Groups Relate to Nature? And I would like you to read two short, again, these are only 4 pages long each, 3 actually, they're 3 pages long. One will be a portion of Tim Ingold's text entitled Indigenous Understanding, 4 Ethnographic Examples. Now he gives 4 examples of 4 different groups and how they relate to nature. Some of it is a little bit dense because it does bring theory into it, but I really want you to focus on the concrete examples that he gives of how people think about nature and how they operate with their natural environment. And then the same thing for, there's a chapter from another anthropologist, E.A. Anderson, from his book, and the chapter is called Learning from the Land Otter, Religious Representation of Traditional Resource Management, from an indigenous group in Canada. So I want you to read those 2 texts focus on the details, and in 50 words or less, I want to say, how do these different Indigenous groups, there are 5 in total that are being described, how do they demonstrate their relationships with the environment as one of 3 things? Number 1, that there's a family or kinship connection to an aspect of the environment. Number 2, of aspects of the environment, whether plants, animals, or whoever, as having self-awareness, having spirits and power. And number 3, how aspects of the environment or nature are supposed to be respected and feared rather than dominated. So what I'd like you to do is use concrete examples and name the Indigenous group you're talking about when you're saying, okay, here's an example of how this particular group relates to this particular plant as a family member, or whatever it is that you find in the text. So again, pause this video, leave these instructions up for yourself, and come back when you've done that. Great, welcome back. That was a bit of a longer task, but hopefully you've managed it. And we'll talk about some of the things that you found at a later date. Okay, one of the things that scholars do, and you guys talked about it as well, is they get very creative and they really want to understand and learn more about the topics that they're encountering. So I have a fun task for you right now, and that is, I want you to be able to picture the Indigenous groups that you just read about, so that you're not just learning about them in a text form, but you can see in your mind's eye what these groups look like, where they live, how many are left in the world, whatever it is. So I'd like you to choose 2 groups that you read about, perhaps ones that interest you the most. And I would like you to look them up on the internet. I'd like you to find some photos that represent that group, and I'd like you to just read up a little bit about them, find an interesting fact about each group. And that could be, you know, that there are only so many people left, or exactly where they live, or how they hunt, or what kind of marriage arrangements they have, whatever it is, something really interesting. So don't spend too long, you know, spend a few minutes for each group, and upload on Canvas to task 4D, 1 photo for each of the 2 groups and 1 interesting fact about them. And then I'd like you to again, use the like button in discussion, 2 peer responses who wrote about different groups to the ones that you chose, but whose facts and photos you found the most interesting. So again, pause this video and go back, do this assignment and come back. Great. So that's the end of section 4. I will see you in the next video in section 5.